Okay.
Doesn't say a lot. Is that what you're waiting for?
Your event is starting.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm still waiting.
Okay. So I think
Oh,
we're live
yeah,
now.
we're good.
And there might have been a few seconds of me staring at whatever just then. So I just want to introduce this again. We're talking about the labor market. We're talking about kind of all aspects of the labor market and what's special about it. We read an article in particular, or some of us optionally read an article about minimum wage entitled "Economists Still Can't Decide Whether Minimum Wage is a Good Thing" by Dan Kopf from Quartz magazine last year. So I wanted to go around the room and ask people what they think about minimum wage. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? You know, what level of minimum wage is appropriate? And how does basic income fit in? Do your views on minimum wage change when you add basic income to the equation? So let's start with Bethany.
Right, so if there's a basic income, then I think I'm against a minimum wage because I think I want the market to be able to flexibly pay people what they want to work for what they wanted to get for their labor. If there isn't, though, like currently, people's primary source of income is jobs, then I have to look at more research on how people's well-being is affected by a minimum wage versus not. And I just feel like I don't know enough.
Yeah, I don't think I know enough about minimum wage. I don't even know if it's different by region, but if it isn't, it should be. I don't even know.
What do you mean by region?
Region of the country, is a...
It's different in different states.
Different in different states, yeah. So I obviously don't have a very good understanding of it. I think
That's
it
fine.
makes sense to have a minimum wage so that everybody can survive. If basic income is in the picture, I don't think that I would change my mind on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Martin, what do you think?
So I'm going to build on the earlier comment of the idea that when you think of, sometimes we measure by GDP or per capita GDP, but another measurement is PPP, which is, roughly speaking, a measure that takes into account that some places are more expensive than others, so the overall sort of economic well-being is different than...
Are you talking about purchasing power parity?
Purchasing power parity. And so to that extent, the idea of a national minimum wage might be, it can be thought about in terms of, well, maybe it makes more sense to decide, even if you're predisposed to the notion of a minimum wage, it ought to be a minimum wage that is not really so much a minimum wage as it is a minimum PPP. In other words, an economic benefit that is consistent by the measure of PPP versus wage, or a fraction of GDP or GDP per capita, whatever.
So wage just means it's coming from jobs. So do you feel like it should come from jobs, or is this kind of independent of that?
Well, my only understanding of when we even talk about it is when it comes from jobs.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's sort of tied to jobs. Probably like almost all these sort of things is, I don't know that you can predict exactly what's going to happen, so you raise the minimum age, and if you have an intention of something to happen, what your intention is may not be what actually happens. If you want to really find out what actually happened, and there are different approaches to studying, okay, we did X, we raised the minimum wage to such and such, what happened? You can study it. It costs money to study it. Very often we don't want to pay the money to actually do the study, but perhaps we ought to actually spend what it takes to study what actually happened and see if there's a delta between what we intended to happen and what actually happened. So I'm not really so much for or against minimum wage. I am for, if you're going to implement a minimum wage, go back and look at what actually happened as you changed the minimum wage and decide if your outcome was what you intended it to be. And if not, do something different.
Okay. Sultan.
There should be minimum wage wage, but it should be calculated very well. It shouldn't be too high. But if there is a basic income, I don't think it is necessary. That's it.
Okay. Richard.
If there isn't a basic income, there should be a minimum wage so that people are not exploited for their labor and they can actually buy, like, pay for their rent or whatever. Like, there's these statistics, like, it would take you so many hours to rent a one-room apartment or whatever at such a wage or whatever it is. But with a basic income, you wouldn't really need a minimum wage because you could probably pay for your rent and most of your necessities, and you may not even have to work depending on the level. And so you could just use it as like a strike income, or a basic income is like for a strike or something, and so you can wait for the employer to pay the amount that you desire to work for or whatever.
So if you're not happy with the wage, you can just say no.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I spend most of my time in my head living in a world where we have a basic income. So when I think about things, I tend to think about things in that context. And in that context, I'm definitely against minimum wage. I feel like there's a lot of, I feel like you have volunteer work, which is unpaid, and then you have paid work, and there's kind of this big dead zone in between the two, and there's opportunities in there for, activities that people might want to do, and they might want to do for a very small amount of money or something like that. And I feel like, kind of defining what's a job and what's not, and what's volunteering and what's not, kind of limits the possibilities of what we can be. Now, in a world without basic income, like the world we live in, politically, I usually, I don't feel strongly about minimum wage, but I usually lean against having any minimum wage at all. And I'm not entirely sure whether having a minimum wage is overall good or overall bad for people. I just don't know. So I kind of think, why not just not have it? Or I'm not going to actively, promote having a minimum wage or something like that. Yeah.
Well, how is a minimum wage calculated in the first place?
Yeah, so it's all political. They decide based on politics, and there's arguments about having enough to live or minimum standard of living and that kind of thing. So something I'm definitely against under any context is the purchasing power parity idea. I think that's a terrible idea. For one,
Terrible idea in the sense of reporting it, or what do you mean?
in terms of establishing it as a goal. So the idea of having minimum wages that are different depending on where you live. Like if you're in a more expensive area, having a higher minimum wage, I think that's a bad idea. And the same thing with basic income. Having a higher basic income in areas that are more expensive, I think, is a bad idea. Because it creates an incentive for people to move to already expensive areas because they know they're still going to be able to afford stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then that pushes prices up even further and causes inflation in those areas. So you end up getting, so by saying whatever the price is, we'll pay it wherever you live. It causes things to just puts pressure on prices to just get more and more expensive in the more expensive places. Whereas if you get the same basic income, whether you live in New York City or live in Nashville, then you get the same amount of basic income, and then you decide whether you want to live in New York City or whether you want to live in Nashville. And then that helps prices even out and be more stable throughout, across and between regions in the country.
But I'm not sure that the basic income all by itself would be able to be a deciding factor between New York and Montana.
Yeah, so for most people it's not, right? But there are people who are kind of on the margin and they're indifferent, like they're on the edge between deciding whether to live in New York and Nashville, and then if you start giving them a basic income, that basic income stretches further in Nashville. So in aggregate, you would see more migration from New York to Nashville, or more people moving to Nashville than
the other way around. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
so that's it.
I misunderstood. I thought you were saying that more people would move to the already wealthier.
That's if you
areas.
adjust to the basic income to give you more in the more expensive place.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I'm
Which is the way minimum wage is now, yes?
it's
No.
different in different states. It's not like for the city and outside.
cost
Like
of
some in
living.
some places they do have higher minimum wages in cities and stuff like that, but it's not all that consistent. They don't just like have an algorithm where they calculate cost of living
Oh, okay.
and adjust the minimum wage based
Right,
on that.
right.
Yeah. So I think the idea of establishing purchasing power parity for people's incomes, whether it's through wages or through basic income, I think is a bad idea. I think it would destabilize things further. Yeah. So, yeah. Does anyone have any more thoughts before we get into the article?
Could you just say that again?
Yeah.
So, or I'll just sort of what I'm understanding you to say.
Yeah.
You are not comfortable with using PPP as a basis for setting minimum wage, where minimum wage would be different necessarily in one place versus another, where the idea would be that, and it would differ because using PPP as sort of the way of thinking about minimum wage, the minimum wage would be the same on a PPP basis everywhere.
Right.
And what you would rather see is a minimum wage that is the same nominal
Yes.
value everywhere, and to the and then let the labor market sort of decide that some participants in the labor market move to areas where presumably that nominal minimum wage goes further or not further, but
Yeah,
it's
that's
still
exactly
an
right.
individual choice.
Yes. Yeah. And when I'm thinking about it, I'm not thinking about minimum wage. I am thinking about basic income. But the same thing would apply to minimum wage. I just don't think we should have a minimum wage. Yeah. So what's special about the labor market?
What do you mean by that?
Well, let's get into a quote. So here we have the article. So here's the quote I'm going to read. The job market, according to elementary economics, is like any other market. It works best if wages are set by supply and demand, not by any other factor. Like government rules. Just as the government doesn't set a minimum price for shirts or avocados, so they should not be telling employers the lowest amount they can pay workers. So the labor market, the job market, is not like any other market. It's different.
It's people's comparing avocados with
right.
people's effort.
Right. So now this comes back to my question: what's different about the labor market as compared to the market for shirts or avocados? What's special about the labor market? People. That's right. So the labor market is how we expect people to get their incomes.
Right.
So I kind of take issue with this idea that the job market is just like any other market. It's not. It's got this special thing that we kind of need to account for, which is people. This is how people get their spending money. Now, we can add, and also when they say it works best if wages are set by supply and demand and not by any other factor, what do they mean by works best?
Can you review what an economist would be thinking with respect to avocados so that we can then see where it does and doesn't
Good
matter?
idea.
Yeah, so the idea with the market for avocados is that you want as many people who want avocados to get avocados, as many people as possible. So you would want the price that they pay to be as low as possible to get the avocados.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a limit to how low that price can go because there are limitations on how many avocados we can produce and stuff like that. But in general, you would expect customers or consumers of avocados to bid down the price on avocados until you get to the point where if it kind of lowered the price any further, people wouldn't be able to get their avocados, and then they would bid up the price back to that level again where everyone can get it. Yeah.
And the assumptions to make that happen would be like you need competition, that kind of thing, in order for the bidding to actually happen properly.
Yeah, so the consumers are going to compete for the avocados until they'll keep outbidding each other until they're able to get their avocado, and then they don't want to go any higher. And then the producers of avocados are going to outbid the other producers to make sure that all their avocados get sold, etc. As long as it's profitable.
What
Richard.
about farm subsidies? That avocados, I don't think there's a subsidy for avocados, but what, for wheat or for
Right.
corn or whatever?
So there's all kinds of economic policies that kind of distort how these markets work. So what I was just saying was kind of like the simplest model of how a market could work. But then we're doing all kinds of things to manipulate the market. So that's kind of like the baseline. But then the stuff Richard brought up will also affect things. Okay. But I think here in the article they're talking about this kind of baseline. So in thinking about avocados and comparing that to labor, the avocados are the labor, and the people eating the avocados are the employers.
Right.
So I want to hire you. You're an avocado. I want to pay as little for you as possible.
Right.
So that's kind of the analogy there
Okay.
between the two markets.
And
Yeah.
the social benefit of that is supposed to be that we're able to produce things more efficiently.
So the benefit of that is that the less that the employer pays for labor, the cheaper he can sell his product.
Right.
Yeah. So if you want to connect up the two, you can say if he's hiring people to grow avocados, then he wants to pay those people as little as possible so he can sell the avocados as cheaply as possible to compete with the other avocado sellers and get the people their avocados.
Right.
So that's the idea.
So
Yeah.
I just bring that up partly because the article didn't mention that benefit. It mentioned whether employment goes up or down with the minimum wage, but it didn't seem to talk about prices
Yeah.
going up and down.
So, right. So it's
not accounting also for profit that the employer might want. So if he's paying his workers less, it's not only that he can compete with the other sellers of avocados, it's also that he might be able to make a better profit.
Yeah, and that's kind of the same argument, because if you're able to make a profit while selling your avocados at a cheaper price than the other people, then you can set a lower price than they can set.
Right.
So it's all kind of connected. It's all about the profit. Yeah. Yeah. So I think in this particular paragraph, it's talking about the job market, the labor market, as if it's a market for avocados. And if you're only thinking about what you get out of the labor, then yes, in our economy we would want to pay as little for it as possible, because then our stuff is as cheap as possible. But there's this other side to the job market, to the labor market, that the avocado market doesn't have, which is that the avocados don't care how much people are paying to buy them, whereas the workers do. So there's this other side of it, which is mostly what this article is about, but it doesn't really distinguish between these two things. It doesn't separate out the notion that we want labor to be cheap, so our stuff is produced cheaply, from the notion that we want people to be paid a certain amount so they can buy what the economy has to offer and that kind of stuff. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But they didn't talk about all the trade-offs then. Like I said, they didn't talk about things.
I mean, we're just talking about this quote right now.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to other stuff. I have other quotes from the article, but I just wanted to start here. Yeah. And see if people have thoughts about this.
I mean, I guess the only other thing I would say is I would reinforce that I think people, because it's several steps, I think in public debates about the minimum wage, I think people
Yeah.
rarely think about how it's going to affect prices, consumer prices. I think they feel like, oh, the
Right.
company just kind of makes a profit, and that's just the benefits the company and nobody else.
Right.
When actually, it feeds back into the prices that people pay, assuming there's
Right.
decent competition and stuff.
And that's kind of like the only thing economists think. Well, it's not the only thing, but it's one of the main things economists
Right.
thinks about.
Or people in general think of minimum wage having to do with the worker and the comfort of the worker, or the quality of life of the worker, and they're not thinking about the price being lower, so
Yeah.
that it's so just supply and demand, which is the more logical way to think about it.
Right.
But
So yeah. So when it says it works best, what they're really talking about here is it keeps our labor as cheap as possible.
Yeah.
It
Right.
keeps our production kind of as efficient as possible. But there are kind of two ways of evaluating how the labor market works, and one of them is how well does it provide labor for the economy, how cheaply does it provide labor for the economy, and the other one is how well does it provide incomes for people, how well does it support the workers themselves. So there's kind of these two things, and when you say works best, in this context, they're only talking about one of those two things.
Yeah.
And most, minimum wage proponents are mostly talking about the other thing.
The other thing.
Yeah. go ahead.
Right. Yeah.
And yet, I will beat my horse again,
Yeah.
because this thing is talking about works best in terms of prices, but the rest of the article evaluates actually the second question, which is providing incomes to people.
Oh, it does.
Because it looks at whether you get more or less unemployment when you
Right.
have minimum wage, which is all about how you're affecting people getting more incomes, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And yeah, so the rest of the article is a little bit different. Economists think about this, but they also think about the number of jobs, and they're like, oh, if you raise the price of labor, there are going to be fewer jobs. In reality, are there going to be fewer jobs if you raise the price of labor? Well, not if you're making up jobs for people to do.
When you say raise the price of
Yeah.
labor, do you mean the wages that you pay the worker?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's the price of labor, is the
Right.
wages you pay.
right.
Yeah,
And
Richard.
There's also automation if you raise the price of labor, like with Flippy the burger flipping robot and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one reason you get more unemployment.
Right.
But I guess I'm surprised that economists, like none of the studies they cited by economists looked at prices. They all looked at unemployment. But I guess that's because so little of the labor is actually paid minimum wage, which they also mentioned. That
They do
maybe the
mention that,
effect is
yeah.
kind of trivial on prices.
Yeah,
Maybe a sidelight, and I didn't read this, I admit, but
yeah.
I mean, we care about slave labor, for example, but
Right.
that's really the most efficient. And I
Right.
know this came up in another meeting.
It's not necessarily the most efficient.
Well, the
but go
lowest
on.
paid. Well, putting, I don't know, was it Nike or whoever has the sneakers that are made somewhere else, and people are, or even Amazon for that matter. But we don't care too much about it when we're getting the convenience of the product. So people care a lot about minimum wage and, the quality of life for people on the one hand, but on the other hand, they don't care that much because they care more that there's more efficiency in the labor market that way when they get the products.
When they're looking at
yeah,
what
So-
product,
yeah.
Here's a question for you. How would you compare slave labor to volunteer work? Neither one of them is paid. What's the difference?
Oh, yeah, I didn't mean to say slave labor, I just meant very low wages because it's not slave labor. But,
Okay, how would you
so
compare
what's-
very low wages to volunteer work?
Oh, well, one is volitional and one is not. I mean,
What makes it volitional and what makes it not?
well, basically, I mean, if somebody has an income, if somebody has a way to live other than from the wages of that job, then they can volunteer.
You can kind of infer
So-
different.
So that's volitional.
So I have more questions along this line, but I want to go to
Okay,
Martin
yeah.
first.
So I don't know that it comes up in the context of this article, but
Yeah.
I keep bringing it up because it's sort of what I hope to get out of our discussions every week.
Yeah.
I think that maybe there's an element of minimum wage and adjusting minimum wage puts one group of workers in competition with another group of workers potentially. And so you do hear this come up a little bit, like, okay, you raise minimum wage because so that a working family can, a livable wage or, whatever. And so, okay, but that laborer who is supporting a family is different than the high school teenager who's working a summer job. You know what I mean? There's just different groups of workers, and we're talking about this a little bit. What strikes me, though, is that as where we are today and where we are in the future, that more, instead of minimum wage kind of affecting not a competition necessarily, but perhaps favoring one, you might say, group of labor over another group of labor, demographically, age, whatever different reasons, is that you're now changing the, if you will, competition between capital and labor, with the idea being that at and we talk about, the burger flipping robots, and I forget what that restaurant is in the area here. I should have gone when I had whatever the Groupon for free meal or whatever it was. The restaurant that
The
is
rice bowl one.
The
fully
Spice, I think it's
robotic,
Yeah.
so to
Oh,
speak.
there's one?
Yeah.
And back in the kitchen, so the kitchen's making, presumably I really should go. It's like, I'm interested in this, I should go, look myself. But there's whatever that cost of production is of those meals, that there's a cost of production that presumably, if it's fully or closely robotic, then it's a cost that is borne by capital instead of labor. And so as the minimum wage goes up, it's not just labor sort of versus labor or somewhere on a labor spectrum. It increasingly becomes labor versus capital, because the capital, both the technological capability of producing what used to be only producible by labor is now becoming producible by capital, and the cost for that capital to produce is coming down presumably dramatically, and certainly in some areas it is coming down dramatically.
Yeah. So
What I mean by capital?
Yeah.
So by
Robots
capital I
and
mean
technology.
robotics, artificial intelligence,
Oh,
automation.
that, you're calling that capital?
right.
It is
Oh.
capital.
Machines and other
Oh.
resources that aren't labor.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, but the companies with the robotics and whatnot are
Yeah.
all saying, "Oh, we're going to keep all these people around, even though they're not necessary." So because it's people are off put by having
Oh.
all
Yeah.
the
Machines.
machines around,
Right.
but no
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
So I think Martin and Richard's point is a good point about kind of the capital displacing labor, especially as labor gets more expensive, maybe through a minimum wage or something like that. But I also think we might have that in terms of like the actual like resources that are going into production, but in terms of the actual number of jobs, if we keep having economic policy that makes up jobs for people to do, that there aren't enough jobs, so we make it really easy for businesses to hire people and borrow money to pay for labor and all that stuff, then the jobs aren't really ever going to go away. They're just going to be more and more kind of useless jobs, and I think that's kind of the world we're living in. Now, I liked your point about. Do you want to say something quickly about that?
Well, I was going to say that Klaus, I forget his first name, at World Economic Forum, I read a report, I don't recall the date on it, but
Yeah.
it's sort of perhaps an update to his book, Fourth Industrial Revolution, that the World Economic Forum, or World Bank, which one, predicts that actually more jobs will be created than destroyed in sort of this fourth industrial revolution, but the article closes on, but it is going to take, I'll use the word enlightened, I don't recall it in the article, it uses the word enlightened, but it will take forward thinking governments and politics to make that, to not get in the way of that happening, okay?
Yeah, I mean that's only true if you think of job creation as a good thing, I suppose. You wouldn't use those words to describe it if you thought that it would be terrible to create all these jobs.
Create what?
If you thought it would be terrible to create all these jobs, you wouldn't use like the descriptor forward thinking and that kind of
Well,
stuff.
I use that, and I
Yeah.
apologize, I'll pull the article up here, but
Yeah.
basically.
It is called Spice, by the way.
The restaurant, Spice with a Y.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Where is it?
It's in Boston.
It's in
Oh, is it?
downtown Crossing.
Oh,
We
okay.
should go.
Yeah.
We should go.
Yeah, we really
Definitely.
go.
It looks
Yeah.
really
I love
delicious.
We should have a meetup there.
Yeah, we should.
I wonder if they'll sponsor us.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to. Martin, I liked your point about the workers who are being paid minimum wage now. If we raise the minimum wage, the workers who come in might not be the same workers as before, and it might not just be a displacement of more casual, like high school students with people who are like have families and stuff. It could be that there are people who have families now who are desperate, who need these jobs, who are not really very good workers, and then you raise the minimum wage, and now there are other people with families who are better workers who come in to compete with them and drive them out of those jobs. So that I mean that's true for like a particular job, but it might not be true. Like across the entire economy, we'll make up jobs for the less competent people to do as well. So I wanted to get back to what we were talking about before, and I wanted to ask how people feel about the fact that workers at Walmart are on food stamps, or some of them are.
How do you qualify for food stamps?
If your income is low enough, and either you're working or you're disabled and not working.
Are these full-time workers?
Many of them, yeah.
So poverty
Also, your
level wages?
dependents, right? It depends on how many dependents you
Yeah,
have.
Yeah.
it depends on various calculations. But there's this complaint among people on the left who say that there's all these Walmart workers who are being paid so little that that they have to also be on food stamps to supplement their incomes. And also there's like advice at Walmart they'll help you sign up for food stamps and get on food stamps and stuff like that.
I have a
Yeah.
counter to that, right?
Go
So
ahead, Chris.
it's a good way. That's a good way of like marketing the argument,
Yeah.
but really it's another way of saying you're not making enough money, so you need to do 2 jobs, right? Which I have friends that right. I mean they,
Right.
or like say if you're a yoga instructor, right? Which doesn't make, every time you get paid quite a bit, but it's not steady,
Right.
If you're a high level yoga instructor,
Yeah.
so they had to take a more steady job. So those kind of things, or let's say you live in the metropolitan area of San Francisco or Manhattan, you could actually have a pretty, by American wage standard, a pretty high paying job, like 135K, which would not allow you to actually live, anything beyond a garage, right, in San Francisco. So it kind of depends on
Yeah.
location, environment, everything. To say that, I think it's kind of not fair. I think.
You think what's
it-
not
I think
fair?
I think to label that it's a minimum wage issue, like the Walmart person, like you said, doesn't get paid enough, right? They had to be on food stamps.
I
think it's-
didn't say they didn't get paid enough.
No. I'm saying.
Okay.
No. I didn't say you said it. I'm
Yeah.
just saying the argument you said the
Yeah.
leftists are making, right?
Right.
That's what they're saying, right? That they had to be on food stamps. I think that particular argument, no matter who said it, it's not quite fair because it really depends on the specific location, environment, and the job skills kind of mixed
Sure.
together. And the other thing too, just on top of the minimum wage, I know
Yeah.
you guys have already discussed this a little late. It's a culture issue. So I was talking to my friends. It's kind of funny that when I was in college in grad school, I go to a Chinese restaurant, right? All the waiters would be Chinese kids, right? And then the people in the kitchen are definitely Chinese. They don't even speak English, right? The cooks used to come out and speak to me in Chinese and we just talk. Now, and the same thing happened with Indian restaurants. And now you go to you pick your Chinese restaurant, Indian restaurant, and I saw this in Boston here, in New York City, just came up from Texas. Everywhere I see a lot more like a multi-culture thing, especially more Latino waiters, Latino waitresses. There's Latino working in the kitchens in a Chinese restaurant, which if you know how control freak are
So-
Chinese restaurant owners,
so
but my
what you
argument is
Yeah.
those are minimum wage jobs. These are all pretty close to minimum wage jobs. Maybe
Okay.
they are minimum wage are a little bit above if you're really good. Culturally, they're stopped being accepted by the traditional people who used to fill those roles not so long ago, right?
Sure.
So the Indian kids and the Chinese kids, they said, "Oh no, I want to be a software engineer now and whatever. I don't want to do this summer job." Even though I'll argue that as a 19-year-old, I think having the job actually builds endurance and skills and ability to deal with unruly customers. Those are actually valuable experiences. It's not really the money you're making, it's just the work. But anyway, that aside,
Yeah.
they're definitely vacating that. American teenagers, I think Tufts and Harvard just did a joint study in terms of there's a tremendous shrinkage in high school kids taking minimum wage summer jobs.
Right.
Not because they're not being hired, because they don't want to. Because there's so many other things to do. They can go take a trip. Their parents are funding them, or they could be blogging. They could just so many things they can do.
Sure.
They do not want to go into a stand and sell burgers, right? Or pack clothes. So the thing is that they're being displaced. So this is very sorry, a long one.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that in terms of minimum wage, is that one thing people are not satisfied with minimum wage. I don't know. It's a matter of how high you're paying these people. Is the type of the job that associated with minimum wage is also not being viewed as attractive by the current culture. Because everybody should go to college, everybody should be an engineer, everybody should be a writer or a blogger or something more sexy. If you're actually cooking or packing clothes and selling stuff in retail, you have deemed a failure. So it's not just the money in the minimum wage, it's also the characterization of the job.
There's more to whether a job is respected or appealing to people than just the wage. I think that's correct. And to your first point about the wages having different meaning in different places, different locations. We talked a little bit about that earlier with kind of the purchasing power of whatever you earn is different depending on what your location is. But I want to get back to kind of the previous question, which is imagining this is not all Walmart employees, but imagining a place where there's a Walmart and many of the employees there are poor enough that they have to be on food stamps. How do we feel about that?
I think it's good. I think
it's
it's
good?
Yeah, I think it's good that they're offered food stamps. And if they have to go somewhere else to work and can't get a job somewhere, maybe that's the only place they can work. Maybe they don't have enough skills to get another job somewhere. So
How do you feel about how much Walmart is paying them?
how much? I don't know.
That they're paying them an amount such that they have to be on food stamps.
Well, are they paying a minimum wage? I don't even know.
Well, they have to be paying at least the minimum wage, yeah.
Okay, so I don't have any.
So
feelings
the
about-
question is,
I mean-
is that is this a specific location of Walmart, or is this entire country?
Are they all
I'm
different?
asking hypothetical questions here to get at people's feelings about these issues. Okay?
I mean, I
Yeah.
don't think that because whoever owns Walmart, the owners, the founders, I mean, they're, millionaires, billionaires.
Sure.
I don't think that because of that necessarily the workers have to have a higher wage, if that's what you're getting
Okay.
at. I mean, the inequality issue is a different issue, and I don't think that can be resolved by the labor market.
Through the labor market?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have any strong feelings that maybe on some level it's wrong that Walmart is paying people so little?
I'll give you another way of how she said it.
I'm asking for people who feel the opposite way, if there's anyone here who feels the opposite way.
Because they should be paid enough so they don't get food stamps.
Yeah, is there anyone here who feels that they should be paid enough that they don't get food stamps? No?
It's not
I mean,
logical.
I think-
Okay. Yeah, Martin.
So I suppose another way of looking at it is, instead of paid low enough that they, if you say need to get food stamps, another way of looking at it is that they should have two employers. One employer being Walmart, who pays them their wage, and the other employer being the one who pays for food stamps and or any other benefits that they receive that are not covered by their other employer, Walmart,
Sure. Okay.
whoever it is.
Yeah. Richard, did you?
There's a proposal by Bernie Sanders that if a person is on food stamps because their employer doesn't pay enough, that the employer would have to pay for their food stamps or whatever. So that would induce them to pay more, I guess.
How do you feel about that proposal?
I don't really know.
Yeah, go ahead,
I
Martin.
will just say, as a little, what I consider almost humorous anecdote.
Yeah.
So my son started, today's Wednesday, registered yesterday at LSE, London School of Economics, which is probably a school a little bit like Harvard, in the sense, and so I was kidding him, because he considers himself on a tight budget.
In London, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was kidding him that honestly, if you're a grad student around Harvard and probably also MIT, I don't know this, they make jokes about, what is a graduate student? He's somebody who grazes all these meetings for pizza, and usually there is pizza, right?
Yep.
So, in other words, if you're a student at Harvard, you're not going to starve if you attend all these optional meetings, because there's usually lunches and all this other. And I'm coming from a martini and a beer and dinner from over at the Intelligence Project. So I'm just as bad as anybody, as any graduate student. And some might also say of people who work at Google. I mean, the IRS started actually going after Google employees, feeling that Google employees should claim on their personal income tax the value of the food that Google provides them, which is practically, working at Google it's a culinary tour de force. It's just wonderful food. And so, anyway, my point is simply the notion of food stamps at Walmart, but you could work at Google, and Google sort of provides you sort of food stamps in terms of, and likewise at Harvard, you can be a grad student at Harvard, well, you can be anywhere at Harvard and go to all these meetings, and you're essentially getting food stamps too, because you just about live on it.
That story.
And I told my son,
that's the
look at
perk of
LSE,
Google.
because you could probably survive.
What about free
food
gym?
So-
free Wi-Fi kit.
So I think
That's ridiculous.
the biggest difference is not. The biggest thing with the food stamps isn't that it's food; it's that it's being paid for by the government instead of by the employer. So Google is still paying for the food.
Absolutely.
And so I don't know that the analogy really holds up in terms of like what people are objecting to.
Yeah.
I
No, I don't
think
know.
Yeah,
It's amusing.
Some of the
Yeah, it is
intuition that I think people have about this being a problem is that they, I think people imagine an employer like Walmart to just be purely taking extra profit at no social benefit, because they're not paying the employee more. Or put another way, they imagine that if Walmart pays the employee more, a few very rich people get slightly less money and nothing else happens.
Right.
This is what I think is in people's minds, and I think
Right.
an economist would say that it's actually transferred to the customer
So
a lot.
thank you for volunteering to be devil's advocate
Right.
and taking my bait. So how do you think these same people would feel if Walmart paid the same amount, but the people they hired happened to be just really rich and just wanting to work at Walmart on their spare time?
Yeah, I think people would be fine with that.
You think people would be fine with that? And then how do you think they would feel if we just had a rule that you're not allowed to hire poor people, that poor people aren't allowed to get jobs because they'll be too dependent on their employers?
Yeah, but so another thing that I think people are thinking is that there's sort of a moral argument that if somebody works a certain amount of time, they deserve not to be too poor. And other people, maybe it's okay for them to be really poor. But if you work full time, there's this idea that if you work what we've agreed is full time, then you shouldn't be so poor that you need food stamps. I think that's another point.
Wait.
Yeah.
So
This is sort of a moral argument.
Can I just say who made that?
I'm guessing at this. This is my sense from talking to people, but maybe
I
I'm
was
wrong. Maybe
I was really
nobody's
hoping
that.
Elizabeth would be here so I could argue with her, but yeah, it's alright.
I would challenge that.
You
That's against
don't
What are you
think
challenging?
anybody has that opinion, or you don't agree with
yeah. You could be working at the wrong job that doesn't pay you anything. That have happened to people, right? You need to be smart enough to figure it out. Hopefully that you're not getting. This happens all the time, even in the United States, where hopefully you figured out this is the wrong job for you because it's not paying anything, and you have enough, drive and smart to get out of that job and go do something else. Because you can't make every job dictate that it pays you a artificial amount that it's deemed enough for that particular, circumstance, location, whatever. That'd just be too complicated, and then it'd be too much. Who's going to do the dictation? The government? It does. I'm for big government. But that's just so much
Who's gonna do
complexity.
the what?
I think this
The calculation?
but I think this
No,
is
I'm just saying dictating every employer, or you have a wage policy that say you have to pay everybody so they have a nice living wage, and you had to put that in the private sector to say that you had to abide by these rules. I think that's way too. The enforcement will be way too complicated.
Right.
So it's impossible. And also, I think I'm just talking enforcement. I'm not even talking about the people who even agree with that particular moral obligation. In
But I
terms of
don't
that,
agree that everybody can just walk away from a job either, or
Right.
that it's a question of drive or any of those other things. There are people who only have Walmart in their area, and it's, you know, a single mother with children, and she needs to pay childcare,
Right.
and that's the only place she can work, and she's not really making enough. So yeah, food stamps makes a big
Right.
difference for her. But she wants to be working. People want to work. They generally don't want to just be on food stamps alone. I mean, most people want a job, and that may be the only kind of job that some people.
But we're not
get.
arguing
So,
about
sorry,
the
Chris.
food stamps. They're arguing
Yeah.
about, because food stamp exists today, right?
Right.
And as it's working in its capacity. We're saying, should additional onus be put on the employers to supplement the role that food stamp is providing? At least that's how I hear it,
Yeah.
right? And that's where I say, like, it's a little dicey because you know talk about market-driven and market demands. You're asking them to
So basically-
provide additional
Yeah.
So
social
basi-
benefit that doesn't translate
Basically,
back
you're
to-
asking how we feel about the Bernie Sanders plan of saying, oh, if they're going to
Yeah,
do food stamps.
well, this is
then
what your
people
question
are
to
gonna
him,
do-
right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that would be the answer. Will be just I think you go into a slippery slope in, you know, who's responsible for whom,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which I think is
Who pays for food stamps? The government?
Yeah.
Taxpayers.
Taxpayers.
The government pays for food stamps.
So it's
We
not-
could debate all day about whether what the government spending is actually funded by taxpayers. I would say no.
Versus
Yeah,
borrowing.
Versus
it should
nothing,
come
yeah.
from
No, versus borrowing, which we
donations.
know.
Yeah.
Without the anticipation of the taxpayer base, you would not have the power to keep printing money and borrow. Can I make that? Yeah.
I disagree with that actually. Yeah.
But that's not the topic today.
That's not-
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm just saying that not everybody agrees that taxpayers pay for government spending.
Because you can be like Venezuela or Germany in the 1930s, where you don't have the you do not have the anticipatory like
That's not
taxpayer,
the
then you just
problem.
go.
That's not the problem that they had. They're very specific and different. Like I talked about this all last week.
Okay,
Very
well,
specific
let's not go
and
there. Let's
different
not go
thing
there. Yeah, we disagree on this, so we can go.
Alright.
Yeah.
So
Um,
anyway.
was there something so with this thought experiment? So it sounds like you don't have anyone in the room kind of on the other side.
Yeah.
Do you want to keep going with this? Is there something you want to talk about with it? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to ask if anyone had any thoughts about whether employers should be, I think just what Chris asked, which is whether employers should have some kind of responsibility to their employees, and what should that responsibility be?
But if you have
That's
universal
really-
income, let's go back to basic universal income. If you have that, to be able, and assuming we just don't print out universal incomes, and assume we get that from somewhere, wouldn't you indirectly get that from all the employers through taxation? To
You're
fund
asking the
the-
wrong
to-
guy, because my answer is no.
No. But I'm just saying. That I can give you that
Yeah.
as a possibility, which actually I think if I am Google or Walmart, I'll be less resistant, mainly because I don't feel like I'm being unfairly penalized because everybody's in the same box. And then if you want to do business in the United States, you will have to abide by this specific tax code, which all the other business being abide by, and voila. Until they revoke it, I have to pay this tax code, and done.
Well,
But you're not individually providing additional benefit. You are funneling the money to the government, and the government distribute it back out.
But to your point about whether
Yeah.
the employer is responsible, I
Yeah,
mean,
or should be.
or should be, that's
Yeah.
a really complicated question.
Okay.
I mean, I remember in the 70s, well, with women's rights and all that, and in the marketplace, you know, being an activist for promotion on my own behalf, and being told, well, you don't really need that much money because you're not going to support a family, and Jim here has to buy braces for his. I mean, people said that out loud then, and I have to say, or you don't need a car. I said, well, I don't even have. You don't need a car. You can take the T. You know, it was like a parental decision on his part how he was going to distribute the money. And I was a worker, and I was doing a great job, and I was as good as Jim, not better, and all of that. And as mad as I was, and I was mad, and I went to Affirmative Action, and I made sure that I got that job, and then I was hated, and you know, there's a whole story there. But it was also true that I could see the logic in somebody making a decision about somebody else's needs and cost of living. And he was in a position to do that because he was distributing the paychecks.
Right.
So it was kind of like being socially conscious, even though not in the way that I would
Prefer.
want it to be. Right, yeah, right. But he was still trying to be that way. I mean, that's the way he believed. And so
Right.
he was trying to act on it because he had that
Yeah.
power to do that.
It's very similar reasoning to the reasoning behind why people say there should be a minimum wage or why they say employers should provide certain benefits.
Right, and that's why
Right.
I'm saying that,
Yeah.
because that's also a slippery slope. I mean, that could mean that who gets to decide who needs what? I
So-
mean, how do people know other people's lives that well? You can't. And anyway, it should be based on what are you doing for your job? How well are you producing what you're doing?
I'll
and
give you a-
how,
How much do we have to pay you to get you to do it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
yeah.
it's tough because on the one hand there are actual human beings in the companies and
yeah,
as the employees, and so you know, let's imagine that a company could get away with really unsafe working conditions and half of their employees died every year. I mean, you could say like, oh, they can get away with it in the economy,
Right.
but there comes a point where you say like, well, these are human beings
They
running
have
a company. They
responsibility.
have some moral responsibility as humans to each
Yeah.
other. And then I think there's sort of I guess I feel like there's a point for me where I feel that way. And so then it becomes this question of like,
How do you feel about astronauts?
sorry,
What?
Astronauts.
what about them?
It's a very dangerous job.
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Do they
Right.
get paid enough, do you mean?
Anyway, I see where you're going with that, but
Okay, good, continue.
I think you might argue that in aggregate, the economy would get rid of people companies that consider a human element kind of above and beyond the economic incentives, and maybe it's not sustainable. But I think I still have a little bit of trouble with that, or like, I don't know. It's still a tricky question for me what the responsibility is.
It's different. It's a completely different culture issue. So the model where the company does not take care of you in large measure is one. You know, the war. There are 3 countries that does not, actually 4, that does not follow this model.
What
Right?
model?
You work for the company.
Yeah.
It's a purely transactional thing, right? You take their money. You know,
Right.
you give them work. They pay you money.
Right.
They can kick you out anytime you want.
Yeah.
You can quit anytime you want.
At
And then,
will, yeah.
right? That model, which is the American and the British started, has pretty much won out. You know, like in the entire world. The 4 countries that still actually fought against that pretty successfully. The prominent one is Japan, right? So Japan is the prominent example where you're talking about it doesn't exist or it doesn't materialize most of the times. It's fun because it's culturally that when you join a company, like you are joining a family. In fact, they're taken to the extreme where you literally on a weekly basis you will spend a lot more time from Monday to Friday with your coworkers than your wife and kids, and you probably only see your wife and kids like on weekends.
It's
Right.
true in America, just not for
No,
some
but people actually hang out with us. So what I wanted to in Japan, like people would actually finish work around like 8 or 9. You actually go home, drink, and you go talk, and you have actually very deep conversations. And people that work for like 30, 40 years, they have tremendous amount of pensions and benefits and everything. And they don't have to worry about when they retire, what's going to happen. They're going to keep the curbs. I mean, the company funds like social programs after retire. They fund their medical care. So it's completely different than the way the U.S. has, right? And then to a lesser degree, you have Germany, you have France, and then you have I put Nordics, all Nordics, into like one country. So they have slight differences between Denmark and Sweden in terms of how the companies approaches it, but it's close, right? It's a little more Spartan in terms of the benefit. They don't give as rich of a benefit as the Japanese and the Germans, but it's pretty good. People well taken care of, people not lacking for things, and they view the company as an important social fabric to their lives versus just somewhere I work.
That's the other extreme from what Alex is talking about, which is just a kind of bare bones of do the work and get paid for what you do, and how is it economically? And so we're talking about 2 extremes, really.
But I tell you
So
what's interesting is that
culture is
yeah.
somewhat orthogonal to what I'm talking about.
You do?
So in Japan, because of the culture they have, in order to get people to do the job, you include them as part of this family, and that's part of what you do to kind of get them to work. So it's still consistent with kind of the thing that I'm talking about. It's not like the other end of the spectrum or something like that. It's just they have a different culture and a different way of incentivizing work and organizing.
I don't know. I agree with that. So I'll give you an example, right? So the Chinese
Yeah.
culture and the Indian culture, especially the Chinese, is very, in many ways, working wise, is very close to Japanese, right? The Chinese culture has the working culture has completely been revolutionized by the American infusion of the last 25 years. So the Chinese companies used to, you don't get paid anything, but but everybody's paid the same. You have pensions, you have public health care, you have insurance, that covers you. The company covers you. Now, nothing. They have gone completely 180 degrees over to the other side. India has done the same thing. So you will have to say that it's by choice in certain economical and historical sense that Japan and Germany and France have made these choices, and other countries, versus the rest of the world have made a choice going completely the other way, to the American way. So it's not just, I will disagree that it's all working the same, because under the same historical cultural conditions, some big countries have completely gone the other way. I mean, I personally don't like it, because I think when you have 1.4, actually between India and 1.4 billion people each, when you just tell everybody to go fend them for themselves with no social safety net whatsoever, it's just terrible to go into the future.
I mean, even in the 50s and 60s, the companies were much more paternal in America.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, there were pensions and there were
Part until the
retirement
70s,
plans and the
when
same
everything
kind of
got
thing.
yeah.
And that's incentivizing, as you put it, Alex,
Yeah.
people to work, to take care of them, then that shouldn't be at cross purposes. I mean, then somebody being socially aware as an employer isn't such a bad thing.
No, I mean you can have different cultural norms that develop. Even in similar contexts, things can just kind of go in a different way, and you end up with a different system. And within the context of those norms, whatever kind of constraints those norms put on the economy, as long as on some level there's still a market, then on some level we can still think about the market working in that way. Does that make sense? Or another way of thinking about it is that perhaps Japan's production is less efficient than the United States, but you can still ask the question of how do you maximize the efficiency within the context of Japan's culture.
Right, yeah.
So
Right.
maybe changing the culture would
Yeah.
improve things, but there's also a way to kind of
Within the
optimize
culture.
for the efficiency of the market within that culture as well.
Right.
And we have a culture too. We have, the culture of, well, this is partly due to culture that we have a minimum wage, but we have a culture of minimum wage, and we have a culture of expecting employers to take care of their employees to some extent. And then we can ask, how can we get the market to be as efficient as possible within that culture, and we can also ask about changing it.
A question
Yeah.
about, maybe this is off the track, but when you keep saying efficient, getting labor to be efficient, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure, what about innovation?
Producing stuff as cheaply as possible, using as little labor as possible.
Okay,
So
but
innovation.
that's not, yeah, okay,
Innovation is important too, and there can be trade-offs that cause more innovation or actually kind of hurt innovation and stuff like that. I think if people have more freedom, like from a basic income or something, that allows people to have the freedom to innovate more. If we're living in a society where we're making up work for people to do, if jobs get eliminated, then we just make up more to go in their place to just give people work, then that kind of constrains how innovative they can really be, because they're kind of being forced to do this make work, this busy work,
It's
right?
very draining.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah. So I just want to get to another quote from the article. So the research has generally found that a wage minimum removed some jobs from the economy, though they disagreed about how many. So the question here is, I would say that removing jobs from the economy is not always a bad thing. Under what conditions is it good, and under what conditions, is it bad to remove jobs? And is it good to have a minimum wage that removes jobs, or is it better to remove jobs in other ways? That kind of thing. If jobs need to be removed, is this the right way to do it for a minimum wage?
How do they show the correlation? I mean, how do they know the job disappeared because of minimum wage?
Yeah.
How do they know that the job disappeared because it was done by the robots?
They go through some of the specific studies a little bit in the article, but basically they're trying to compare pre and post implementing a minimum wage in one place with a place that's very similar, and they didn't implement the minimum wage. And they didn't go into the details, but economists are pretty good at trying at least to control for various factors and like use clever natural experiments and clever econometric techniques. So I'm assuming they did that kind of thing here.
So like
Another point that this article makes is that for every study that showed that minimum wage was good for the economy, there was another study that showed that minimum wage was bad for the economy. That
But
kind
how
of
would it
stuff.
remove jobs from the economy?
That one is, I
Wage
think,
minimum.
easier to understand than how it would add them, which is that basically you're making it more expensive for every person. So you're creating an
For the
incentive
employer.
for the employer. So let's say that like right now the robot is
Yeah.
slightly more expensive than the
Right.
person. If you make the person more expensive, you might go with the robot instead.
Right.
Or you might decide to just like push your other employees a little bit harder or just do without that labor or
Right,
that
right,
kind of thing.
right,
So
yeah.
I think that makes
Yeah,
sense.
and it's not just about the robots too. It could be that there's a business where they're profitable now and they're hiring people at current wages, but then if they're forced to raise the wages higher, they're no longer profitable. So even when you look at a place like Walmart, part of the reason those guys got so rich was because they were able to be efficient, including efficiency in their labor. So we look at the Waltons and we say, oh, they're so rich they can afford to pay people more. But the reality is that it's possible that forcing them to raise wages even a little bit could cause the whole thing to go out of business.
Right.
We've seen big chains, big businesses go out of business for various reasons.
Right.
You guys remember the Hostess cupcake strike from like 6 years ago, 8 years ago? Yeah. So there was you guys know what Hostess is, right? They made like the Twinkies and the cupcakes. So they had their factory, all their workers went on strike, and the management just decided this is not profitable anymore. So they just shut the whole operation down. And you can still buy Hostess stuff again, but that's because someone else bought the brand and started producing those products again. It's not those workers again. So a lot of times there's this perception by the workers that they're being treated, they could be being treated better by the employers, but maybe it's not necessarily always the case.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe it's not a viable business anymore if you have to pay them more.
But this is where like you go back to. I mean, I don't want to like make like Adam Smith sound like what he didn't say, right? I mean, he said a lot in his paper, not just the invisible hands, but I think the spirit really is that in a lot of these cases with the private sector, there's only so much you can do on an overarching like governmental policy that you can install, right? A lot of time you do just need to let the market dictate what the demand is and what people want to pay for, and you can go in and fill the gaps, but you can't direct a business to do something that's harmful to itself, because that might have unintended consequences to the whole thing, and then you end up losing a lot more than what you try to fix.
And you can't just replace. I mean, like to some extent we can manipulate things or regulate things, but you can't go too far because prices are important signals about how much stuff should be produced and that kind of stuff. So if you have a completely planned economy, like Venezuela, then you kind of eliminate the markets. Then
you argue that their economy is completely unplanned.
Well,
they try to plan it, and then turn out to be completely unplanned.
The markets just kind of went underground, and now there were illegal markets that had really high inflation, where the prices were different, and so there was. But what they tried to do is they tried to kind of plan out the economy, and then when you do that, if you're saying make X amount of avocados, then you don't know how many avocados people want, because the way you find out is through markets. How much are they willing to buy? How much, what price are they willing to pay, and that kind of thing. So markets are really kind of efficient at distributing and allocating resources and incentivizing production and stuff like that.
So back to your question,
Yeah,
I
go
think and I think Mom said things too. I think it's healthy that when job gets eliminated organically,
Yeah.
like it goes away organically, and it's not like all of a sudden there's a gap of function important to society that's not being performed anymore. Because if that's true, then that job will still exist. So if it just goes away organically, like horse carriage
Yeah.
drivers. Well, they used to be big in the United States, when we had no cars. There's no more horse carriage drivers.
Wait,
Yeah.
if they go away because of minimum wage, couldn't it be that you have some function not happening? Because like,
No,
it
because
could be that it would be profitable to produce certain products at a price people want to buy them if the wage was lower, but it's not profitable anymore at the higher. Like let's take it to the extreme. Let's say you raise
Okay.
the minimum wage to $1,000 an hour.
That would be cool.
You would clearly
we won't be like Venezuela.
You would really disrupt a lot of function, right? Like you would clearly force a lot of things would stop being produced that are being produced now that we get a lot of value out of because it would just not be worth the labor price to produce.
So I will continue our argument. So if all minimum wage goes to 1,000, but and let's go with Alex's Twinkie example. I love Twinkies, and I still want a Twinkie. I'm gonna talk to my friends. Look, see that fact that makes Twinkies? We're gonna forget this minimum wage thing, right? We as a group, we're gonna get a group together. We're just going to go in there. We're gonna get a supply. We're gonna start making Twinkies because we know that there's a set amount of people out there at a minimum that will buy Twinkies. But this is where the under.
Wait, but how are you making these Twinkies? I don't understand. You're volunteering.
No.
He's working
Yeah.
under the table.
Yeah.
Like an immigrant coming in and picking stuff
Yeah.
up or something like
Well,
that.
Like
I would
this-
just argue that turning it into a black market is probably going to be less efficient.
Right.
I guess some
No,
of it
correct.
turn
But
into a black
I'm just
market.
saying that job. What I'm saying is that no matter how high you raise the wage, you literally cannot eliminate a critically need service or product from the marketplace
I
because
disagree.
people want it.
I think you can make a huge impact on what's available. If you're
Yeah, I
In
mean,
a
like,
sh-
if
in a
you
short-
come
in
up
a
with an
short
example,
term.
like
In a-
Twinkies are something people really need, so you can never eliminate Twinkies.
Yeah, you can never
Shut
eliminate
down
Twinkies,
the
yeah.
Hostess factory, someone will come in and start making
But
Twinkies.
what that movie-
That's what happened in the
That's
real
that
world.
movie with Woody
Yeah.
Harrelson. Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
he drove the entire world in Zombieland to find a Twinkie.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think Bethany's right. I think there are some things that maybe they're not critical things like the things you're talking about, but there are some things that just wouldn't be made anymore if you raised
Yeah.
wages too high.
I think it's a matter of
you don't know
Yeah.
that people need them, but they
Yeah.
never get innovated,
Right.
they
Right.
never get started.
And then another question we might ask is how many things are there out there that people would really like that aren't getting made because the minimum wage is where it is? Like how many things would we have if there were no minimum wage?
But Bethany, I'll just give you
Yeah.
one thing. So I think it's a matter of time frames. So short-term time frame, maybe even to intermediate time frame, I agree with you. Like if you stretch a time frame to be a proportional length, I disagree. I think every product of needs will be filled over a long period of time because the market and the people will always adjust.
What if you're in Venezuela?
Huh?
Or
They'll adjust too.
Soviet,
It's called
or
a revolution. So
You mean like via political adjustments and stuff? I mean,
no,
I don't know,
it'll be a mix, right? It depends on the circumstance, and I mean if they have a dictatorship,
Yeah, like
and
what about
that's
North Korea?
that's like a,
I mean,
yeah.
North Korea's been in their situation for a while now.
Actually, so I do not want to go into a different tangent. So
all I'm
the
saying
North
is like,
Korea, say the North. So I'll shorten this to say the North Korea have a very well-functioned black market, and the people's poverty is grossly oversold in the Western media.
Okay, that's a fair point.
So if you actually go visit North Korea, you actually see that
do you,
I mean,
you can actually pretty much get anything that you need.
Do you disagree that it's more
Have you
efficient
been
to
to
have
North
it?
Korea?
I haven't been to North Korea.
Do you disagree that it's more efficient to have it not in the black market?
Huh?
Like, are you saying they're equally efficient, a black market or?
No. I'm not arguing about. So I wasn't sure. So I didn't think that we're arguing about the efficiency. I thought it was more arguing about if you eliminate one job, would the people be able to get that particular product or service anymore? So I'm saying they can still get that product and service. Potentially it's less efficient, but you
Well,
can
but
get the
if
product and
If
service.
it's more expensive, then some people are not getting it who would have gotten it before.
Oh.
I mean, it's a matter of degree.
So now we're talking about like a matter of degree.
So-
No, like
Yeah, I mean,
matter of-
I-
yeah.
We're all of this is a matter of degree, right? Raising minimum wage a certain amount has a certain effect, and it might eliminate some jobs. It might cause some things not to be produced anymore.
Or
but
might cause
certainly
fewer people to be able to have
nobody's saying that, like, that markets won't emerge, that black markets won't emerge, and that kind of thing. We already have black markets for labor in the United States, immigrants
Right.
being paid below minimum wage, and other people working below minimum wage and that kind of thing. But I think my position here is that a lot of jobs should be removed from the economy because they're not necessarily productive, but the way to remove them is not to raise the minimum wage. I don't think that's the right way to do it.
Do you have an idea about what the right way is?
Yeah, can you guess what it is?
Yeah,
Yeah. So,
voluntarily, because you don't
Yeah.
have to work.
yeah. So I think basic income is the way to do it, and when we talk about these different policies and the effects they have, basic income is kind of like the furthest removed from causing any kind of distortions in the market, because it's just about giving people money to spend, and then they can freely spend that money wherever they want, and then producers can make decisions based on profit, how to capture as much of that spending as possible, and then it's just it's a lot simpler. Yeah, and then of course, if you have a basic income, you don't have to make up jobs to do anymore.
Or food stamps, hopefully.
You probably won't need food stamps anymore. But there's nothing saying that minimum wage can't coexist with food stamps. But once we have there's nothing saying that basic income can't coexist with food stamps. But once we have basic income in place, people might realize that the food stamps aren't really necessary.
Yeah, why would you need food stamps?
Maybe no one will qualify anymore
Yeah.
because the basic income is so
Yeah.
high or something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we already talked about the fact that there are some jobs that people will not want to do ever, unless there's a really
Yeah.
big pay, a big salary attached to it.
Yeah.
And those jobs could right now be even the lowest paying jobs.
Yeah. So certainly
Some
under
jobs shouldn't, some jobs we have to have, whether people want
Yeah.
to do them or not.
and if there are jobs we have to have and people don't want to do them, then under a basic income you'd expect the wages to increase in those jobs.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, and then if there are jobs that people really, really, really love to do, but maybe they can't afford to do them in their current economy because they're not earning enough to survive or something like that, you would expect the wages in those jobs to decrease under a basic income. So you'd expect some to go up and some to go down.
So you agree,
Yeah.
if we have basic income, we should be able to eliminate minimum wage altogether?
Yeah,
Mainly because, see, if I work for, say, McDonald's,
yeah,
but before I had no income, right? But now I have basic income, they will have to pay me more, potentially, to make me work for them, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So there's
Or
really
get
no,
flippy.
yeah, there's no need, so, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I
With
think
a
that's
really
right.
robotic arm doing this,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sultan.
I think there is no job we have to have that cannot be automated.
Eventually, yeah.
You think so?
Yeah, I think.
I don't know. I've had this argument with
Did we-
Alex
did we have this, like, a month
before.
ago?
I
So-
thought about it. I couldn't find a job that cannot be
What
automated.
about writing? What about
Well,
writing?
There
All
are
you have to know is
Right?
that
They are doing.
Yeah, yeah.
I know,
Yeah.
Alex
For
showed
AI.
me some of the stuff that
There's
goes
AI
all you
composers,
have to know-
AI writers.
all you have to know to settle this is that we are machines, right? So as soon as we build machines that are
Completely different discussion.
Yeah,
completely
but then
different
that's
discussion.
different because
Totally
then
different
we need to have
discussion.
rights and stuff again.
And
we might
I
need basic
even
income.
checked about it. I
No.
even checked about it about toilet cleaning. They made it automated.
What is it? What cleaning?
toilet cleaning.
Oh, toilet cleaning.
Yeah, even
Oh,
they
yeah.
made it.
Oh,
That's
Japan!
good.
Japan had that like
That's
50 years
okay.
ago.
No,
Like,
it's this one is different, not
Okay.
like Japanese.
Yes.
Yeah, so-
Coming
I
back
love
to
those. I love those Japanese
Yeah.
toilets. It's my favorite.
So I think
Yeah.
there is no job that.
Okay,
So
but
I think-
think the more intellectual jobs are going to be hard.
So I think
Yeah, maybe.
Sultan, I think you're right, but I also think there's another important point, which is that we will never live in a world where all jobs are automated. So it can be at the same time true that any job can be automated, while at the same time true that it will never be the case that all jobs will be automated. Because you can imagine a world in which everything is automated, just hypothetically. Imagine a world in which all jobs are automated, and we're living in this world, and then
I
you can
like it.
imagine. Then you can imagine a scenario in which someone would say, hey, I want to pay you $2 to spend your time doing something other than what you would normally be doing. And that's a job. So there will always be jobs. there's never not going to be jobs for people to do, but at the same time, any job can be automated.
Yeah,
And
even
both of these things are true.
I don't agree
painting,
that every job
I mean that's fine that you
I
don't
mean,
agree
even
about
can.
that.
We know that.
Yeah.
painting and composing music, they automate.
I know, they do,
And
they automate poetry, but
I believe that human-made things will be more valuable in the future.
yes.
For arts, for example, not
Right.
for everything, but it will be still valuable.
Well, it's just
Well,
in
that's
the same
it.
way that an original painting is more valuable than a forgery that looks exactly the same.
Right.
Actually, by using big amount of data, they are doing that really.
What, doing what?
Painting,
That are exactly the same as the original.
they can do it more creative with.
Well,
huge
good luck
I
finding
know,
a
but-
1700
But the
paper
value
oils.
is still gonna be for the.
They actually-
they're carbon dated. For
The
example.
original.
I
Let's go to
completely
Richard.
They actually-
agree with you. I like
talking
the
about
human
painting, they had
they do everything.
AI created a series of paintings about this fictional family, and then they're selling them for like $30,000 a year, not a year, each on like Bartleby's or something like that in London.
Oh,
Hmm.
interesting.
Yeah, I
Some
mean,
people with discretionary income, it's like, I need that.
Yeah,
I
I need basic
really need
income.
that. What does that say? Nobody else has it. But I'll just make one thing to your argument. I agree that every job that you can imagine and see today, within the foreseeable time frame, they can be performed by a artificial intelligence. But the human mind and our developments has not. So I think a lot of times it's hand-wringing stuff, right? In terms of humans
But
coming.
we have lots of time to
Right. So that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if you.
But I-
I haven't finished it. So our evolution in terms of our
takes
our
long time.
Now let me finish. So our evolution from ape to now took a long time, but if you look at the gaps, it's very interesting. So like for 90% of the time, right? So it's like from a million years back to about like 10,000 years ago, our progress from a neurological point of view is probably like 5%. And then from 10,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago, you had a huge jump, right, in terms of intellectual processing and processing. And then for like the last, like let's say the last 1,000 years, it's another huge jump. And then between the last 200, it's another huge jump. So it goes in exponential waves. So when people talk about the
so Chris, you
evolution,
complain when people don't let you finish, but then you just go on for a really, really long time.
yeah, this is the key. Yes, you haven't discovered that.
Yeah, we take a pause, like a
Yeah.
time out, and
Time out.
come back.
I like this part,
Yeah.
time out, or like the
Yeah.
this is
So
the Christian time
I
out.
want to get back to the labor market. I think regardless of whether you agree with me and Sultan that everything can be automated, there's still this effect on the labor market of automation, and there's certainly factors of like, oh, I want to pay. There's two objects that are exactly the same, and one of them is handmade, and nobody can tell the difference. But this one has a certificate of authenticity. Someone might pay more for that. That's really that's kind of a separate thing outside of when we
Okay.
talk about labor and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's yeah.
A lot of
but-
labor goes towards costly signaling though.
A lot of labor goes
Gosh.
towards costly signaling. Yeah, Richard.
Well, there's this tribe at the like the Eskimos or whatever in Alaska. They had this ceremonial
Right.
like pot or whatever that was 3D scanned, and then they
Oh, cool.
the other one was the original was destroyed in a fire, but they used the copy as exactly as they would the original. They had the same spiritual significance or something.
Cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, what about
And then
So-
like at the Brazilian fire last month, I think
museum burn down? Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
saying there's a lot of calls for 3D scanning and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of this stuff is just what we value as a culture, and some of that might change and some of it might not. But this is kind of a separate
Yeah,
thing from the
it's-
labor
yeah,
market.
it's separate.
Yeah.
Well, sort of, it's a tangent, it's a little tangent.
It's a tangent. It's not separate, it's just a tangent. Yeah.
One thing that I think relates to minimum wage in the labor market, and basically
Louder. Yeah, go ahead. One thing that
Yeah,
relates to
is
minimum
that-
wage in the labor market?
is that currently most people who aren't getting minimum wage have a certain amount of bargaining power. Like that's probably why they're not earning minimum wage, right? They have like other alternatives or other things that they could do, and so you have to pay them a bit more than the government mandated minimum to get them to actually do that job instead of something else, right?
Yeah, in aggregate, I would say that's true. There might be specific people who are working in specific jobs that pay a lot, but those kinds of jobs pay a lot, and you wouldn't be able to get everyone to work if you paid them minimum wage. Maybe you could have gotten that guy to work at minimum wage.
Okay, but I guess why I'm bringing this up is that basic income also provides a certain kind of bargaining power. So I think
Yeah.
one of the things that people want a minimum wage for is to protect people who don't have a lot of bargaining power. But in that sense, a basic income is an alternative to giving people the ability to have a decent circumstance for themselves. You don't kind of need the protections
Right.
like a minimum wage.
You don't need to protect people who have no bargaining power if those people do not exist.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that addresses one of the underlying reasons that people care about minimum wage, and also some of the other kinds of regulations that you have.
Yeah. So I think back to this quote. I just want to take a different angle at it, which is that the researchers found that minimum wage removes some jobs and disagreed about how many. But I think, at least in like the pure economic theory, they're not thinking, I think I already said this, but they're not thinking about the other things that are going on in economic policy that are kind of protecting jobs and creating jobs and stuff like that.
Although one thing I was just thinking about is
Yeah.
sometimes somebody might be looking to this research as a town or as a state and making a decision about minimum wage, and they very much could lose jobs to other towns or other states, even if this policy is in place, I think.
Oh yeah.
So in that sense, it's relevant.
Yeah, for sure. When the government creates jobs, it's often not targeted at specific regions. So you have some regions that are kind of depressed, and some regions that are have a more booming economy and that kind of thing. Yeah. Any thoughts, Martin?
So I'm half listening to the conversation, and it's sort of like bouncing back and forth. But I'm sort of thinking of the book Bullshit Jobs, which if we're going to go down this road, of like minimum wage, removing jobs, and all that kind of, then I actually recommend people read the book. Not so much I'm not promoting it because I agree with it, disagree with it, or because the professor's at LSE and I told my son to go meet the guy. But the premise of the book is that there are a lot of jobs that happen that if the job didn't happen, this is my word, but you wouldn't miss it. It's like you wouldn't notice kind of. It just, the world wouldn't end because this job was no longer there. And, basically the author's position is how many jobs exist for which you could really sort of look at it and say, not only would you not miss the job if it were not there, what the heck is it there for?
Right.
And then the author, I would say, sort of to his credit, agree or disagree with him, but to his credit, he sort of says, here are the mechanics, or here are the, I'll use mechanics. Here are the mechanics that cause that job to exist, where you might otherwise take a step back from that job and say, that job doesn't really add anything, so why does it exist? But it does. I mean, people really do pay companies, or, and their bosses, and their middle managers, and the middle managers have jobs because the company believes they need middle managers, and yet some might say that if you were to take those middle managers out, the work would still happen. You know what I mean? So
That's
Yeah, I mean,
exactly the example that I was thinking of in big companies.
And people are making business decisions because they believe that it's worth paying for this labor.
Well, and it's also that people have to go somewhere in these promotional
Exactly.
ladders. So there's an
it's a train-
assistant
it's a
to an
training wheel.
assistant to an, like the office, the assistant to the assistant manager, not the assistant manager, the assistant to the assistant, because they were somewhere else, so now they create these positions for people, just
Yeah.
because
But they wouldn't-
need to, but they're
They wouldn't be
useless.
creating the positions unless on some level they believed it was good for the company.
Well, yeah, right, good for the company in the sense
Yeah.
of
Unless it's this kind of
keeping,
paternalistic
maybe
thing.
retaining that person, yes, paternalistic.
So again, I would say read the book, just because he might make a little bit more complete discussion of, you know, what causes certain jobs to happen than a simple one that one might express, you know, in a few minutes. And I say that, I actually read the book by the guy who was President Clinton's protective Secret Service agent, and the whole thing with Clinton, you know, and the sex scandals and all this sort of thing. And so he wrote this book and blah, blah, blah. But his book really comes across, he's very critical of what you might call middle management and even upper management in the Secret Service. And I only say that from the standpoint of, if you were to ask him if all that middle management were bullshit jobs, he'd say, well, they're absolutely bullshit jobs because I could have done my job, and in fact, all they did was cause me headaches. And so you can find, you know, frankly, as a military officer and a military commander, I suspect I had some soldiers who said, "Sir, you've got a bullshit job. I could do my job if you weren't here telling me,
Yeah.
you know, issuing orders and all that kind of stuff." So, you know, you have to go a little bit beyond sort of this simplistic.
But
So I
let me
think-
follow
I
that.
think
Your
among-
opinion. So
No,
your
no,
walk-
I just want to. I want to say among the jobs that look like they're not needed for the economy, many of them probably are needed, and you just can't see it. You can't see how and why they're necessary or why they're useful and stuff like that. So I think there are jobs that look like bullshit that are actually valuable. There are jobs that look like bullshit that are actually bullshit. There are jobs that look very valuable and useful and, you know, profitable to the company and all of that, and, you know, like you can show like how good it is, but that ultimately the economy doesn't need because maybe that business shouldn't exist or something like that. So I think there's kind of like all these different categories, and you can't tell just by looking at a job
Right.
whether that's a job that's going to be eliminated in an efficient labor market.
Right.
Go ahead, Chris.
No, I'm just saying, like in a military hierarchy, like your general would not be able to do his or her job if all the colonels and lieutenants and every leader are eliminated, and they would just be the general and like us, you know, tens of soldiers. They will have the general have to be.
Okay,
You know.
so let's get on to this next quote. So all economists seem to agree on, all that economists seem to agree on is that there is some limit to how high the minimum wage can go without causing serious damage. Besides that, it's hard to know what to believe. So I think
What's your reason for
for highlighting this one?
Agree on. Oh, all they seem to.
All
agree.
they seem to
Okay,
agree on, right? I read
Good.
it with the wrong kind of
Emphasis,
intonation
yeah,
and
the
emphasis at
inflection was
first.
wrong.
Yeah, the
Okay.
inflection.
Alright,
Um,
can't without that.
All they agree on is that there's a limit, and if you
Oh, really?
and if you get too high, you're going to cause serious damage. So
What
I think.
kind? Okay, go ahead. What kind of damage is it?
Well, Bethany had the example of $1,000 an hour minimum wage and what that would do to the economy,
Right.
right? So, you know, black markets might develop and stuff like that, but it wouldn't be efficient anymore. Everyone would be kind of trying to work against the system in order to get markets to work,
Right.
that kind of thing.
In which case you no longer have that minimum wage if you've just got black markets replacing it that have lower wages.
Sure, yeah, so you've just added inefficiency and everyone's not getting paid. They're either, they don't have jobs or they're getting paid very little in the black market or something
Well,
like
the
that.
job goes away altogether.
Some combination.
Yeah, there's a combination of all these things that are kind of bad. So economists agree on that, that it can get too high, but they don't really agree on how high it can get. And I would ask, is the minimum wage already causing serious damage? Has it caused serious damage in terms of what we're able to produce in our economy? What we would be producing? Yeah, I have Bethany.
Is there anything that you could look for to know? Like currently, like is there any data you could collect or like a way that you could find out?
I mean, I think it's hard to know, but I think we can look at things like volunteer work, unpaid internships, and stuff like that. That there's kind of this, I mean, like I was talking about before, the fact that there is this whole kind of dead zone between completely unpaid labor and minimum wage. You know, there's all those possibilities in there, and it just feels like there's opportunity that we're missing in terms of what's possible in the labor market. So I don't know if that really answers.
I
You're
know
looking
it's
for
a
concrete
no.
data.
Like for example, how significant it is. Like, could you look across different countries that have different
Yeah.
levels of minimum wage, or like are other variables too different between them? Could you look across different states?
I don't know. You might be able to. You might be able to look at states with lower minimum wage and higher minimum wage, but there's all kinds of
There's some
confounding
confounds,
factors. Yeah. I don't know.
I wonder. Yeah, it's tough because it's so small scale.
Yeah.
It's hard to measure. Like in the kinds of experiments they look at in this paper, it's hard to measure factors besides local unemployment.
There are plenty of countries that doesn't have this what we call minimum wage structure, but they have a better social infrastructure. To me, this point is, Alex, I honestly don't see the point of highlighting this, because if the thing gets high enough, it will start competing with like real wages that people gets paid for, right?
Yeah.
And then the market will just kind of nip that in the bud.
Well,
I don't understand
we can
why
s-
they even have to debate the point. Of course, they all agree to that.
So,
it's common sense.
So here's another example. Like under the table labor and immigrant labor, like we were talking about before. These are things that already exist in our economy, and they're not regulated under normal labor regulations because they're all black market, under the table stuff. If we didn't have a minimum wage and someone's picking strawberries for $4 an hour, then maybe they're only getting $4 an hour, but they're at least recognized as real laborers, by the regulations and the laws and all of that. So I think maybe I didn't have to highlight this one, but it really spoke to me in that I feel like minimum wage is already causing serious damage in our society.
In what way?
In the way I just said, you have like these black markets for
Some of
labor.
distortion,
And that's-
so
Okay, so that's all you're thinking about, the ways we talked about.
Yeah,
I thought
and-
you had a specific.
And the opportunities that we've missed in terms
another
of the
way.
possibilities for the types of jobs and things that could be in between volunteer work and minimum wage. I also think a big part of the damage that minimum wage does is it makes us feel like, okay, we've done something and we're taking care of people, when really we're kind of masking this problem that people's incomes aren't high enough for them to benefit the most from the economy.
So Alex,
Yeah,
it's an easy one, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so you had the data for this on that laptop.
sure.
One with minimum wage installed in the United States.
1938.
Good memory.
That was when the national minimum wage was.
1940.
So this is
25
That's during the FDR time, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
it's during FDR. So let's look at the unemployment rate before the unemployment rate before. Let's not do it right before because it's Great Depression, right? Let's just go 50-year average of the time before 1938. Let's assume that's the date of the unemployment rate, economic productivity per person, like adjusted for real dollars.
So what are you trying to do here?
50-year average before the minimum wage is installed,
Yeah.
and then let's do the average of the 50-year after the minimum wage is installed.
Average of
per capita production in real dollars, unemployment rates, in society.
It's really hard to know the counterfactual because so many other factors are pushing.
No, that's correct. That's correct. But I'm just saying it'll give you a
I don't think it gives
and
picture.
then we had the advent of electricity and the automobile, and then we had
I don't
afterwards
think
we had
that-
World War II.
I think
and,
everything's so
yeah.
dominated by technological growth and like
Yeah.
those political factors that there's just no way to get the signal from the
Well, you can probably look at
So
specific
this is-
sectors, like special labor sector that's
Yeah,
not
I mean,
technology.
I don't think we really need to.
No, I'm just saying if you really want an intellectual, honest discussion on that, and you want to look at impact, if you want to say it's doing real harm, right? You would need to look at some historical data and extrapolate that out. You can't just guess.
I'm not really a data guy. I gotta say.
Well, then
More of a
it's
theory
kind
guy.
of tough,
Yeah.
because then you're just
it's
flying
not,
by the seat
it's
of your
not that
pants.
tough. I mean, it's hard with data. Is really really hard to get right. It's really really hard to interpret correctly.
So
I've
we
done
just
some.
don't get it. So
I've done some data science and machine learning and statistics stuff, and it's it's not a trivial thing, and you can come up with data to support a lot of different arguments. I'm not saying data is useless, but for this kind of thing, I think the theory is more relevant than
The
like
data?
50 years before and 50 years after 1938.
That's
No, I'm giving you an example, right?
Yeah.
I'm just saying if a Siri is worthless
Anyway,
without the data.
Just since we have this quote highlighted, I thought this part was really interesting. So until the advent of a federal minimum wage in 1938, men were deemed outside such paternal protection in light of the U.S. Constitution's explicit protection of the right to free contract. So men didn't get the minimum wage. It was only women and children. Because children could work back then, but they got a minimum wage. Yeah. So I just thought that was an interesting factoid.
Yeah,
Um,
I was interested.
This article is available.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that reminds me a little bit of your point about sort of wealthy people volunteering and sort of getting paid some kind of trivial minimum wage.
In terms of they thought of the men as being able to be self-sufficient, so
Exactly.
they didn't need this protection.
Not exactly bargaining power, but they basically thought of them as having some kind of ability to make their own decisions in a way that was reasonable.
Well,
By the way, you
phrase-
have some of that now. You have like stipends paid for certain kinds of jobs that are not per hour,
Yeah.
and they're probably
$300
They
a month
could be below
stipend or
minimum
something.
wage.
No, the women and children was addressed to a specific sector. It was the textile sector.
Textiles, yeah.
Yeah, because they were working for like 10% of what the man was making, and they're working for like
Yeah.
12, 13 straight hours and dying.
Yeah, we don't need to.
Anyway,
get
but
into
I'm
that.
just
That was
saying the
like
reason they made it
side.
women and children is
Yeah.
because of that.
Yeah,
They were reacting to that specific
that
sector.
makes sense. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So I kind of want to end with this quote. One common misconception about the argument is that economists in favor of minimum wage are pro-poor, and those who don't support it are pro-unfettered capitalism. In fact, many economists who are not in favor of significant hikes to the minimum wage are in favor of other policies they believe help the poor without distorting markets. So I think this speaks to the issue that nobody is pro-poverty. Everybody wants to live in a more prosperous world, and there are political differences about how we can do that. Yeah, go ahead, Beth.
Sorry. I mean, I agree with that, but I also think they're saying something more specific here, which is that people who generally fall along the lines that we consider politically more pro-poverty can still disagree on this issue of a minimum wage.
Pro-addressing poverty?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are political factions, at least in the United States, that basically are more likely to say that people who are poor are sort of at fault for their own poverty and things
Yeah,
like that.
you're
So
right.
at
Responsible.
fault for their own
Yeah.
poverty
Yeah.
and that kind of thing. So I do think there's kind of a spectrum in terms of how much people want government to intervene in addressing poverty.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's saying that economists who believe in the government helping the poor, or regulations helping the poor, they can still be in favor of that without being in favor of minimum wage.
Exactly, or
Yeah.
increases in minimum wage.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think I actually fall into this category, being pro-basic income but anti-minimum wage.
Right.
Yeah.
Wait, have you already done a topic where with basic income, would there still be poverty? And are you okay with that?
We've talked about poverty. I think.
No, I'm just saying like as the results, right? So, to me, like
No, I know what you're saying.
yeah,
So we haven't had a whole meetup specifically. There's always relative poverty, but there wouldn't be, like people starving or below poverty levels in terms of their basic needs and stuff like that.
Could be disparity, income disparity, or inequality, but
There'd be
not
plenty of
poverty.
inequality and plenty of relative poverty, but no more absolute poverty, unless we redefine what absolute poverty is, and then we'll have another target.
I think the absolute poverty always get redefined. That's
Yeah, but that's a good
yeah.
thing. Yeah, because then we have a new goal. Yeah. Yeah. So there's one other thing. No, I think that's it.
Right.
I think I want to. Does anyone else have anything to say about this quote?
No, although I think it's interesting that here you probably have a difference between the scholars looking at the issue, the economists, and the sort of general public. Where I'm guessing, and they don't speak to it, but I'm guessing that like the pro-minimum wage, anti-minimum wage thing falls fairly cleanly along political lines, although I don't know.
False
What
clearly
lines?
along political lines.
Yes,
Yeah,
I agree.
among non-economists.
Yeah, I
Like
agree.
probably Democrats are generally in favor
Yeah.
of an increase in the minimum
Yeah.
wage. Republicans are generally not. And I bet it correlates highly with other government intervention among lay people as compared to among the economists. So that's
Yeah.
probably why they had to point that out. I guess that's why it's a misconception.
Yeah, I think that's right. So people think that economists are, driven by politics, maybe more than they are when it comes to economics.
But among the blue collar voters who are Republican and Democrats, the wage level actually the Republicans are actually lower.
Right, but being
So
against,
actually so just think about that. So they overwhelmingly voted against the increase in
right.
minimum wage.
So I'm talking about who's in favor of government intervention, which is paradoxically not always the people you would think in terms of the benefits that happen from government.
No, but they know.
intervention.
But I would argue that they know from the ground these Republican blue collar workers who you will think theoretically can benefit from this raise in minimum wage, right? They vote against that for not just purely for spite.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would give them more credit than that.
Yeah, we've talked about the issue. I think it may have come up last week about people voting against their own interests and that kind of thing.
No,
Oh, they don't think they're voting against their own interests.
yeah, I would
Oh.
say that that's kind of arrogant to assume that they are dumb. They're just dumb and they vote against their own interests. I will give them more
Right,
credit
I'm not
than
saying they're
that.
dumb. I'm saying that there are people who we perceive to be voting against their own
We
interests.
perceive them voting
Yeah,
against their interests.
right.
But there's
yeah.
they have their own reasons.
There's good reasons, yes. Yeah. So let's go around. Or actually, I don't know. Let's go around the room and get people's thoughts on basic income and the labor market. I don't know how productive this discussion was, to be honest. But I'm curious if anyone's thought about anything new or feels any differently than they did at the beginning of the discussion in terms of the labor market and minimum wage. Bethany.
Yeah, I think I've thought just a little bit more clearly about different consequences of the minimum wage or having it at different levels. I think one thing I was thinking about in my head that I didn't say it is we talk about price inelasticity of demand among consumers sometimes. Is there something similar sometimes among companies where there's kind of a range of wages that they're willing to pay, and it won't really affect the product's price that much? And under those circumstances, it seems like you could capitalize on some social welfare by increasing the wage. And so I wonder how much of the world is like that, and how much of the world people are assuming is like that when they're in favor of minimum wage. So that's just kind of one additional thought I'll throw out there.
Cool.
I guess I haven't really thought that hard about minimum wage, so tonight I was thinking more about it than I would have. But I was also thinking about it from the employer's standpoint for the first time, because I employ people,
Right.
and I wonder about whether or not I'm paying them enough, or whether I'm paying them too much. Actually, I'm more worried about paying them too much. Because I don't really know what other people are doing. They're not doing what I'm doing, because I made it up. So I can't really judge, and I haven't heard. So I started thinking about, well, actually, minimum wage has a big impact on the employer in a way that I hadn't thought about before. So that discussion is useful to me.
Cool.
Yeah.
Martin.
So I'm going to kind of agree with you, Alex. I'm not sure how much we got out of this discussion this evening. I'm thinking, so the topic was labor markets. We've talked a lot about minimum wage. There's an article about minimum wage. And perhaps not as much about basic income in the, anyway, so I think we have a little bit of philosophical discussion, minimum wage and good, bad, and, kind of come out in the article and all that sort of thing. So I haven't really changed my view. My view is that changing the minimum wage affects the economy. If you want to know how it affects the economy, change the minimum wage, then go back and study and try to understand what happened to the, a little bit of discussion 50 years before, 50 years after. Yeah, it's really hard to do certain kinds of studies like that. And you can only gain so much value from, I'm usually totally pro study a problem. There's statistical methods, there are all different kinds of methods, RCTs and everything about, how you can sort of look at problems. And you do it, but you do study it. If you don't study it, and it's really just sort of people's opinions, then it's okay, but let's all recognize it's just opinions.
I will skip.
Okay. Chris.
So I want to finish before I had to her. So
Yeah.
our just joking.
It's your time.
Yeah. human evolution. So we're keep on gaining. So no matter how slow that you think we're going, we will still at the end outpace the machines. So there's hope. It's like the tortoise versus the rabbits. So if you ever heard that like paradox that, you know, if one person goes like half the distance where I'm going to hold this, no matter how slow I'm going, that person will never catch up.
Zeno's paradox.
Yes,
Yeah.
So anyway, just on minimum wage, yeah, I guess the article wasn't inspiring enough really for me to change opinion. This is what probably the only time me and Alice agree. I think minimum wage is, from an economic point of view, inefficient. The government made a rash decision because they were under tremendous pressure under that time between depression and wars that they had to address the issue. It was never set to be a permanent solution when they installed this measure, and then they just stuck because they can't see anything better and they just forgot about it. So anytime that happens, that can be improved because it was a temporary measure. They haven't stuck around for another 70, 80 years. So they can be definitely improved on that. Is that basic income? I would say they're completely different things. I think basic income have its merits, it's going to perform its functions, and people really need to look at whether minimum wage as an entity is really valid in today's economy, you know, because we have changed so much. So to me, they're kind of apple and oranges.
Richard.
Well, you were talking about human progress. Well, I've read about how in the future, we could integrate technology into our bodies, and how people like the Amish or whatever could, once our integrated technology becomes advanced enough, they could be like considered disabled or retarded or something because they were standing for.
Maybe a zoo. Let's go to the Amish zoo. We can watch the Amish people. That's terrible.
Okay. So I think for me, my opinions didn't change. But I think the key thing for me is that I've said this before, that people need to be able to spend to buy stuff that the economy can produce. They need spending money, and we have to have a mechanism to get them that spending money. Historically and traditionally, we have expected that mechanism to be the labor market, and that expectation has led us to distort the labor market in various ways, including instituting minimum wage to try to get people incomes through the labor market, and something like a basic income allows us to really separate out that concern, the concern of how to get spending money to people. That's kind of the problem that basic income solves, and then once you're solving that problem through a basic income, it becomes a lot easier to allow the labor market to be as efficient as possible in production, using the minimum amount of labor to produce what we need to produce, and paying as little as we can to get that stuff produced and to get that labor. So that's kind of just my concluding thought there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love these things, these discussions. Next week we're talking about entitlements and help me out.
What are we talking about?
Equity, you said
That's why I still have
inequity.
Chinese citizenship.
I
can't
can
know
go to the
that.
page.
What's the opposite of entitlement?
Do they really
What is
suffer
your
a lot
Luxuries,
or-
privileges?
Oh man.
Okay,
Yes, in China.
I think it's just different. So
Yeah.
I grew up in China.
Next week we're talking about
I have-
entitlements. It's gonna be
I have
good.
certain
Wait,
view of
hold on.
living
Is it on
standards,
that
right?
page yet?
So obviously,
Yeah.
in the United States, the living standards are very different.
Oh,
meritocracy.
meritocracy.
Meritocracy. Yeah,
Meritocracy.
Ron suggested this one. So see you guys next week for meritocracy.